I was backstage at a show and I just started. I just had Once a Day, my very first record. And she came up to me and she was talking to me and she asked me how old I was.
For decades, Connie Smith was the golden voice of the Grand Ole Opry. With a career that began in glory and a voice that critics once said could break your heart with a single note, she was celebrated, honored, revered, but also quietly discarded. Now, at 83, Connie Smith is done being silent. In a rare and emotionally charged confession, she finally reveals what the Opry took from her and why she never felt whole on that stage again. What happened behind the velvet curtain of country music's most sacred institution? And why did it take her 60 years to say it? Let's begin where the dream began and where it quietly fractured. In 1964, Connie Smith was a 23-year-old mother from West Virginia, barely scraping by when she entered a local talent competition. She had no agent, no plan, and no expectations, just a haunting, raw voice and a dream stitched into every note. Within a year, she was the toast of Nashville. Her breakout hit, Once a Day, exploded across the charts, making her the first woman in country music history to hold the #1 spot for 8 consecutive weeks. It wasn't just a debut, it was a phenomenon. Suddenly, the quiet girl from Hinton was being hailed as the next Patsy Cline, a comparison that thrilled the press and burdened Smith deeply. By 1965, she was inducted into the Grand Ole Opry, a dream she'd carried since childhood. She had watched from a distance, on radio, on TV, as the stars of the genre stepped onto the Ryman stage with reverence. Now it was her turn. The applause was thunderous, but even then, there were whispers backstage about her independence, her refusal to conform, her sudden rise. Some called it jealousy. Others would later call it something closer to sabotage. In those early years, Smith was working harder than almost anyone. While many male Opry stars enjoyed full support, tour funding, primetime slots, and regular media rotation, Smith found herself frequently pushed into awkward time slots or untelevised appearances. Her contract at RCA was strong, but her Opry positioning was precarious. One year, she received less than a dozen weekend slots, despite having multiple top 10 hits. She kept smiling. She kept singing. She didn't complain. Because in 1960s Nashville, complaint was career suicide. But the most troubling part wasn't the gigs she didn't get. It was what happened off stage. In recent conversations, Smith recounted moments when male stars blocked her dressing room access. How she'd overhear Opry producers refer to her as the pretty face with too much edge. She recalled being asked, repeatedly, not to perform gospel songs during her Sunday shows, even though her spirituals were what audiences most responded to. And she began to realize something. She was welcome, so long as she stayed small. So long as she never asked for what she'd earned. By the early 1970s, as Smith's personal life shifted, through divorces, depression, and faith, her relationship with the Opry soured. She took a hiatus, citing creative burnout, but insiders later revealed that she had threatened to walk entirely after producers refused to allow her more airtime for gospel segments. One anonymous staffer would later describe her as a powder keg of talent being kept in a broom closet. Still, Smith returned, again and again, out of loyalty, out of love, out of habit. But inside, something had already cracked. By the time the 1980s arrived, Connie Smith was a living legend in country music, but you wouldn't have known it from watching the Grand Ole Opry. While her male peers, many of whom had fewer hits, shorter careers, or lesser critical acclaim, were elevated to headliner status, Smith found herself quietly demoted. Some nights, she wasn't even listed on the programs. Other nights, her slot was cut short, her song selections changed without notice. In private interviews, Smith recounted one night in 1983 when she was told, minutes before going on stage, that her performance was being bumped to make room for a newer male artist with a crossover single. Smith said she smiled, nodded, and stood backstage as her moment disappeared. "I wasn't angry," she said softly, "but I knew that something had shifted. I wasn't the future. I was just a fond memory they weren't ready to let go of, but weren't willing to honor." In truth, Connie Smith had always resisted becoming a marketing product. She didn't dye her hair platinum. She didn't chase pop trends. She never wrote scandalous songs or posed for tabloids. She remained stubbornly, consistently, authentically herself. And in the flashier, louder world of 80s country, that quiet strength became her vulnerability. The Opry began limiting her slots further. Some years, she performed fewer than 6 times. New artists, many of whom cited her as an influence, got primetime billing while Smith played to half-full houses at 4:30 p.m. on Sundays. Fans noticed. Letters were written. Even other artists, like Emmylou Harris and Ricky Skaggs, privately raised concerns. But nothing changed. To the public, she was still an Opry member. But in the back halls, she had become a ghost. She stopped attending Opry meetings. She began spending more time at church, more time writing songs nobody would ever hear, more time wondering whether it had all been worth it. And then came the night she walked out, without telling anyone. It was a Friday, September 1991, scheduled for a 2-song slot. One of her gospel pieces was abruptly cut by producers that evening, allegedly due to length concerns. Smith stood backstage, looked down at her set list, folded it, and walked past the curtain. She didn't come back for almost 6 years. When asked why she left, she responded simply, "They forgot who I was, so I reminded them what absence feels like." When Connie Smith returned to the Opry stage in the late 1990s, it wasn't with fanfare. There were no welcome-back montages, no formal acknowledgments, just a subtle listing in the program, a mid-show slot, a polite round of applause. But something else had changed. Her dressing room, once labeled with her name in brass, had been reassigned to another artist. She was offered a communal space instead. The message was clear. Her legacy, while respected, had been relocated. Literally. She later described that moment as the first time I felt like a guest in a house I helped build. What hurt wasn't the downgrade. It was the symbolism. Smith had performed more times on that stage than most living artists. She had inspired generations. But in the new Opry ecosystem, driven by branding, TV syndication, and youth appeal, she was no longer seen as vital. Her slot remained inconsistent. Her set lists were reviewed more aggressively. Once, she was even advised not to bring it down too slow with spirituals, as the showrunners were aiming for a higher energy profile. She complied, then quietly began refusing some bookings. The breaking point came in 2002, when Smith, during a private Opry event, attempted to honor the anniversary of her debut with Once a Day. She had prepared a short story to introduce the song. Producers told her she didn't have time. A younger artist's set had gone long. She sang the song. She didn't speak. She left through the side door. Later that year, she gave a private performance at a small church in Tennessee. It wasn't filmed, it wasn't promoted. But those who attended said it was the most emotional rendition of Once a Day they'd ever heard. And that's when Connie Smith made her quiet decision. She would no longer wait to be acknowledged. She would write her own story. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, Connie Smith remained a revered presence at the Grand Ole Opry, even as her airtime slowly diminished. She had earned her place not just by chart success, but by voice, heart, and resilience. Yet by the late 1980s, the phone had stopped ringing as often. Not because her talent faded, it didn't, but because her relevance in the Opry's new image had started to fade. Over time, Smith's appearances declined year by year. One 1983-1984 Opry calendar logged her to appear 9 times. By 1988, that number dropped to 5, and by 1990, 2. By 1992, she hadn't been invited at all. For an artist once synonymous with the Ryman Steps, the absence hit deep. The Hall of Fame stamped eternal membership, but the booking sheets showed desertion. Her manager tried to persuade her to speak up. "You can push," they said. "You'll get the gigs." Connie refused. She didn't want to be labeled a nag. She also didn't want to be positioned as a publicity pawn. Silence, she believed, had dignity. The same grace she carried in song, she carried backstage. But the silence started to speak. Fans wrote letters. They asked why she'd stopped appearing. She never answered. It wasn't because she didn't hear them. It was because she loved them enough not to stir industry gossip. Insiders later explained that new programming visions preferred younger crossover artists, pop-country blends, and more brand-friendly personas. The same producers who once praised her authenticity now voiced concern. Her voice, too pure, too emotional, too rooted in traditional country, made the new lineup seem stagnant. Still, they kept her Opry membership intact. They never canceled it. They simply printed her name less. Then, in 1994, Connie agreed to a tribute performance in celebration of Dolly Parton's career. She was asked specifically to sing a duet of one of Parton's early songs. Partway through rehearsals, Opry leadership informed all performers that Connie was to sing a solo instead. They feared combining Dolly's brand with Smith's more traditional style would confuse audiences. The performance became what fans now call her ghost set. She sang beautifully, but it wasn't publicized. It wasn't televised. The audience applause was polite, but fleeting. After the show, several attendees noted on forum boards that they'd looked for press coverage. None appeared. Later that week, she received a press release celebrating Dolly's tribute. Connie's name was omitted. Even the side-by-side mention of past stars was gone. That blow cut deep. It wasn't publicly humiliating, not at all, but intimately marginalizing. It confirmed a shift. Her legacy would be footnoted, not front-lined. She continued releasing albums. She toured sporadically. She stayed in gospel music circles. But she never regained her place in the Opry's heart. By the mid-1990s, Smith's presence, once robust and consistent, dwindled to special guest. That label, she told one interviewer, felt more like an apology than an honor. As the years passed, she accepted fewer invitations, not because she didn't want to appear, but because she could no longer bear the shrinking spotlight. After all, what hurts more than being forgotten isn't erasure. It's being seen only as a page of yesterday's programs. Connie Smith eventually received one deserved honor: induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2012. It was meant to be a crowning moment, a public acknowledgement of her decades-long influence, her chart-defining voice, and the countless artists she inspired. Yet, true to painful pattern, her induction came not through fanfare on the Opry stage, but with a private luncheon at the hall. The Grand Ole Opry was not officially involved. Officially, there had been no spokesperson, no performance, no acknowledgement from the place where her career began. She received her medal, gave a humble speech, and left. Many press photos that day show her clutching the medallion with grace, but in eyes that seemed to carry both pride and sorrow. For someone whose career was intertwined with the Opry's mystique, the missing moment stood out like a faded stitch. What made it worse were the remarks that followed in interviews. When asked if she would sing at the Opry again, she said simply, "I'm not sure I'd want to relive something that never fully knew me." That quote echoed everywhere, not as critique of the Opry, but as a lament on mutual recognition denied. In fan forums and retrospective articles, the commentary shifted. Many viewed her omission during major Opry milestones, e.g. the 75th and 80th anniversaries, as glaring snubs. Despite being widely celebrated in country folklore, Smith was absent from both televised gala celebrations. Critics began to analyze the irony. A figure canonized in mainstream country music history, but intentionally sidelined from the venue, meant to define that history. Smith herself didn't call for an apology. Instead, she asked for remembrance. She told interviewers she wanted a legacy based on grainy footage, heartfelt lyric, and vocal purity, not based on an absence or perceived slight. She recounted her disappointment, for the industry to honor her record without honoring her stage. But she also expressed a quiet understanding. She had seen how things change in Nashville, that sometimes fidelity to authenticity costs access to the center stage. If her name etched in the hall was backgrounded outside, she said she'd rather remain truthful than perform erasure. Journalists sometimes framed this as her stepping off the stage tactfully. For Connie, it wasn't performance, it was preservation of self-respect. The Hall of Fame medal became a testament. The world still saw her, even if the Opry stage dimmed its spotlight. For decades, Connie Smith carried silence like a song, familiar, wordless, haunting. She rarely spoke publicly of her hurt with the Opry, rarely aired grievances, even when her presence waned. But over time, that silence began to fracture. In private interviews at age 78, she attempted to articulate what many fans sensed, but few voices acknowledged. She spoke of being grateful, always grateful, for music, for fans, for the Opry's early support. But underneath it all lay a reservoir of unspoken hurt. She told one interviewer she felt silenced, not by threats, but by subtle retracts. Fewer calls, changing time slots, altered credits, restricted content. She recounted repeatedly being discouraged from singing gospel tributes during Sunday shows, while male artists were allowed entire gospel hymns as centerpieces. Resentment, she clarified, was not hate. It was dismay. It was questioning why the same passion that made her beloved could also be treated as inconvenient. Smith also reflected on the emotional labor of invisibility. She described a time when a young artist performed her songs live at an Opry tribute, delivered passionately by a younger voice, and she had not even been invited to attend. No invitation, no backstage access, no program. Then she was expected to watch from afar, or not at all. She confessed this conditioned something in her self-worth, which made approaching old age feel strange. She said that if the Opry could move on from her while keeping her records, then eventually they might close the door to her memory entirely. That fear, she whispered in an interview, was scarier than illness or retirement. In her silence, there was sadness, but it was isolated. Interviews with insiders revealed that many staff respected her artistry quietly. Many younger artists cited her as godmother of authenticity. Yet institutional memory remained selective. The fundamental damage was not in a single decision, but in how repeat omissions added up. Each skipped show, reallocated dressing room, removed credit, or denied acknowledgement compounded into one message. Connie Smith was no longer essential. Her unwillingness to retaliate painted her as generous, but generosity costs something too. At age 83, she decided not to remain the silent essential. Not anymore. She said she didn't intend to shame the Opry. She wanted them, and the audience, to hear her truth. Because silence, she said, can bury not just the moment, but the meaning. When Connie Smith first spoke publicly about her troubles with the Opry, she was in her 70s, brief, guarded mentions about disappointment. But at 83, she finally lifted the veil entirely. She sat for a quiet interview at her West Virginia farmhouse, front porch overlooking the hills, reflecting calmly but resolutely. "I've carried this for too long." She explained that aging shifted her perspective. With time, regret morphed into clarity. She no longer felt the need to protect her image or shield others. The indignities became less about envy and more about enduring loss. Speaking was not closure, it was reclamation. Family and longtime friends encouraged her. They reminded her of battles she silently endured, scheduling blow-offs, backstage gossip, canceled gigs. They urged that her voice mattered, that a lifetime of exclusion deserved acknowledgement. Smith said the decision to speak publicly wasn't recklessness. She recorded her recollections in letters, memoir fragments, and interview notes decades earlier, but never aired them. She refrained from speaking out because it risked burning bridges at a time she still wanted them open. At 83, she acknowledged what she had lost: faith in fairness, trust in institutions, hope in reciprocity, but gained what she could not sacrifice before: personal liberation. She knew the Opry would ignore her statements publicly. She did not expect apologies. She didn't want statements or spotlights. She wanted truth. She said, "If fans understand even a fraction of what I did without them, it redeems the absence." In performing interviews, she carefully framed her message. Not complaint, but storytelling. She wanted to remind younger artists that backstage still carries weight. That legacy can be erased not with cancellation, but shortage of attention. That silence from institutions is often worse than blunt conflict. Her voice was steady, factual, unnervingly clear, recounting decades of small exclusions, rehearsals canceled last minute, set list vetoes, unreturned invitations to reunions, lack of archival footage credit, and cumulatively treated as invisible. She concluded the interview with a personal request. If fans remembered her for one song, she hoped they'd explore her albums, musicals, and gospel songs. Not for her, but for the art. She asked the industry, preserve the whole version, not just the fragment. By openly sharing memories in her 80s, she reclaimed her narrative. Sensible, quiet, irreplaceable. In the interview, Connie articulated forgiveness, though not toward an institution, but toward systemic assumptions. She framed resentment as systemic rather than personal. Not the producers, not the stagehands, not even individual artists, but a legacy system that prized youth, marketability, and narrative simplicity over foundational depth. She said she didn't hate the Opry. She loved it, in its early years. She respected the stage where she made her name. But she could no longer pretend leadership treated her with the reverence they once did. That conflict, she clarified, was not about singling out individuals, but about structural memory. Who gets heard, who stays, who is archived. Smith described one moment. During a rehearsal for another artist's induction, a spotlight technician refused to adjust lighting for her because she's not on the official list. That same technician had helped hang her own banner decades prior, but procedural updates meant she no longer existed. Rather than bitterness, Smith framed such incidents as disheartening. They weren't shameful. They were indifferent. Still, her disappointment was not endless. She spoke of grace, how she carried love in her voice even when backstage felt cold. She spoke of gratitude toward fans, radio stations, and artists who continued covering her songs. She didn't forgive the Opry through silence. She forgave it through memory. Because what they removed from me was not my voice, but visibility, and I will sing regardless. Connie also reflected on systemic forgiveness, toward Nashville's creative ecosystem, toward the shifting tides of country music, and toward herself. She said, I would never ask for what is not mine to retake, but I expect to be allowed representation. Her tone, mixing compassion with clarity, struck many listeners. It reframed grievance not as entitlement, but as demand for acknowledgement. She invited generational responsibility, not for one act, but for many small ones. When asked what she would say to indie artists, she said, "Don't assume your absence is due to choice. Don't mistake omission for insignificance, and never apologize for persistence." Her message wasn't vengeful, it was vigilant. She didn't want recriminations, she wanted remembrance. Since Smith's statements became public, conversations in Nashville have grown. At panel discussions, universities, and songwriter circles, her case is frequently cited in talking points about institutional treatment of female artists. Cultural commentators reference her story in lectures about gender bias, memory erasure, and gatekeeping in country music. Opry insiders remain silent. But behind the scenes, several procedural discussions emerged. Who is on the algorithm for anniversary broadcasts? Who was invited for the 85th anniversary show? Connie's name was reportedly added late, though still not slated for prime TV inclusion. As one insider put it off record, "We're repairing, and she's noticed." Some younger female performers began crediting Smith during interviews, acknowledging not just her influence, but her erasure. One rising artist pledged to cover Once a Day on her debut single for tribute. Another music nonprofit announced a songwriting scholarship in Connie Smith's name, aimed at women preserving classic country style. Publishers and producers also took note. Biographical books on the Opry are being revised to include sections on women sidelined by shifting trends. The phrase, "the Opry squeeze," began circulating online, referring to the slow reduction of airplay female legends have faced. Smith's bold declaration sparked small corrections in archives. A fan-run site verified 10 previously misclassified episodes featuring her in the 1960s. Some bootleg recordings gained renewed attention. Collectors prioritized restoring gospel performances cut from official releases. Perhaps most telling is the way she is being remembered anew, not through CMT Legends episodes, but through human empathy. One radio host called her radio biography one of the most powerful stories of quiet injustice uncovered. At a Country Stars reunion broadcast, the host introduced her not only as Once a Day legend, but as the woman who finally said what happened. Smith's admission didn't spark mass protest. It sparked reflection. But reflection, she's shown, can carry force. Now, at 83, Connie Smith wants more than her name etched in gold. She wants the fullness of her story honored. A stage performance is not what she demands, just consistency, honesty, and acknowledgement. She hopes the Opry will revise its archives to include her photo and biography, not buried in early attendee lists, but featured on official websites and anniversary broadcasts. She wants tribute shows to credit her contributions outside of Once a Day, and for her gospel leanings to be recognized in the show's spiritual heritage. She spoke of desire, not for gifts or headline slots, but for equitable visibility. That her name not disappear from milestone programming. That library archives update notes indicating she sang there regularly. That memoirs and promotional materials list her beyond her debut. Most of all, she wants fans and future generations to understand the invisible toll of institutional neglect, to see how celebrated artists can be sidelined, and to learn how absence can be as telling as presence. When asked for final words, she said, "Sing every song, not just the number one. Cherish the backstage grace, not just the standing ovation. And remember me, not for how they honored me when I was canonized, but how they treated me when they forgot I existed." In that simple phrase lies a lesson not just for the Opry, but for all institutions built on memory and silences. She finally spoke. She finally redirected the spotlight on her career, her candid truth, and what structures cost her. Connie Smith didn't ask for fame. She asked for fairness. Subscribe, comment, reflect. Who else in music history was forgotten behind the scenes? And what silences need telling?